Well, can you believe it? We're back with the Citroen C3 Picasso. I've been out the country for a couple of weeks, and the first day I left, the missus said there's a strange noise coming from the front suspension, and after close investigation discovered a spring has snapped right there on the suspension then. Right, all this brings into question my thoughts on the quality of parts these days, because I've been driving other vehicles which are 20 plus years old and never had this issue. And I mentioned it to a few people in the garage, and they say, oh, it's to do with all the slow bumps and everything they've got on the speed bumps and things they've got on the roads these days. But it doesn't explain why much older vehicles don't seem to have this issue, because I've heard of Mercedes and BMWs and quite fancy sort of prestigious cars coming in with broken springs. So yeah, basically my job today is to replace that spring, and I know it's always really awkward access on the Citroen C3, so it'll be the usual fun and games getting behind those wipers and things, because the strut is right behind there somewhere, so the access is terrible. But we'll give that a bash, and we'll show you how we get on. Well, here's our issue. I'll see if we can zoom in and focus. Can you see that? Let's see. There's that loose bit of spring just there. Oops, there it is. I'm wiggling it about there. That's broken from the top section right up there. So the spring still sat in quite well, so it's just that little section there, the sort of nearly a full circle of spring, the top bit there has snapped off. And just there, if I'm pointing to it correctly, that's the bit where it snapped off. And so we have a little play around with that, take all that apart. And from past experience, if you've seen any of my other videos, it's a horrible job taking apart all the suspension strut on a Citroen C3 Picasso, but all fun and games. Here we go. Right, I won't go into too much detail, but hopefully if you haven't seen it on my other videos, it'll give you an opportunity to check out my other videos regarding Citroen suspension. But all this has got to come off here, all the sort of plastic trim and the wiper blades in as well, so we've got to undo there. So and that's just in order to get access to the top mount of the suspension there. So please check out my other videos if you haven't seen that, and I think I show it how to do all that in there. Right, I thought I might just show you this. This might be a useful little tip for you. So I know some people have struggled to get the suspension strut or whatever out of the housing of especially on these models. I think Peugeot's the same. So what I've done is I've undone the steering link here, the track end rod, and I've undone the anti-roll bar link, and what else? Obviously undone the clamp that holds the suspension housing in place there. But you can't get enough travel for it to come right down, so to release that. So what I've done is I've used another jack, and I've lifted up the sort of compressed the spring and lifted up the suspension in order for me to get that travel there. So you can see now I can move that out the way. So and a good little tip which I learned, you know, from trial and error, is leave that connected at the top there, so you've got the possibility of pushing that out the way there. And always remember, this is obviously loaded, so you've got a bit of compression there, so I've just used a bit of 4x2 timber there. So hopefully that makes sense, but I know some people do struggle with that, so that's a handy little tip there. And you can see we've got that right out of the way there. So I'll crack on with that, and we'll show you how we get on. Right, just a quick tip which is worth mentioning: take the brake caliper off, because I found the tension was too much when I was trying to pull that out of the way, but you can see we've got it right out of the way now. So that's basically it. Right, just undoing the top of the suspension here, and I did the other side, but this side's a lot easier. All this wiper rack and all that doesn't seem to be in the way, but I'm just doing a few sort of small turns at a time, and I got the angle's awkward, but we're getting there. And so I'm just taking that top bolt out, and then the whole lot should just drop out then. So I'll crack on with that. But I just thought last time I had to remove all the wiper assembly, but it's much easier this time because this bar was in the way. So I think we're going to progress with this side a little bit quicker. If you just want to have a quick look around here, you can see we've just got it hanging off there now, and just a few more turns and the whole lot should drop out. I'll put the spring compressors on there. Perhaps I'll show you the exact damage then once it's off as well, and you can see what you think then. Okay, I'll press on. Right, now I've got it all out, we can see what the actual issue is. There's a bit of the spring at the bottom there, which should be at the top. See, it's snapped off there, it has. So like I said earlier, it's a bit worrying why you should get a spring snapping. For me, my experience, I've never really experienced this with older vehicles, so maybe they're just using inferior materials now. But we'll press on, and because the spring had snapped, there's something worth noting which could have been a bit dangerous. Normally I don't need to use the spring compressors because the spring's held in there, so I can just take the whole unit out and then compress it and then dismantle it to put the new spring in. But that wasn't sat in how it should normally sit in the mounting there. So it escaped basically, and you know, there's quite a lot of force being held in a spring like that. So just bear that in mind if you ever a snapped spring like that. You see, the spring wasn't being contained properly within the strut unit there as well. So just be wary, because if you're not careful, that could have ended up being a bit nasty. Rightio, we'll deassemble that, and we'll get the new spring in, which is just coincidentally, it's just over there. I've picked up a part, that's a KYB K-Flex. So and then I'm also going to, just because on the other side the top mount had worn out, this one's in perfect condition. While it's as it is, I'm just going to put a new one on anyway for what it's worth, and just in case this one does perish, at least we got two new ones on either side then. So I think you'll catch that on one of my other videos, and on the other side replacing that. So we'll just basically undo that nut and reassemble it all with the new spring. Right, there's the old spring dismantled, and you can see where the offending, I've just put them next to each other, just double checking the size. That would have obviously gone on like that. So I always just do this just to make sure I'm getting the exact replica back on. And I'll probably take this bit of cushioning off and put it on there as well. It looks like they put some sort of adhesive on there or something. So we'll get that back on, and like I said, be extra wary when you're taking a broken spring off, because that wasn't contained within the suspension unit and it did fling off quite strongly and powerfully. So we'll get all that back together. Alright, just got the old spring back in now, the new spring, sorry, and just a little bit of advice, make sure everything's lined up properly before it goes back into the housing there. And I was quite surprised at how much you got to compress the spring to get it back into the sort of suspension housing there. It's a huge amount actually. So I probably wound that in a sort of a good, probably 7 or 8 inches, you know, to enable me to get it back into position there. So just be extra careful. I'm not one for health and safety lectures, but there's a hell of a lot of potential energy stored in there, and I'm sure it would do some serious damage if it came undone. So just take your time if you're ever doing those, and a little bit of caution there, which is very unlike me, but even I felt a bit nervous doing that. So we've got that fixed in position, and I'm just going to prise that back into the bottom of the housing there. I've cleaned that up with just a bit of WD-40. Not quite sure whether I should put a very light film of grease on there or not. Perhaps I will, just to make life easier in future, just in case. So we'll get all that back together, and then we'll have a final report. Right, we've got it all back on. We've got the anti-roll bar linked back in, and the steering rod in there as well, and just tightening everything up, the back thing. So yeah, like I said, just take time in making sure that all lines up, because it's got to slip back into the original position. Make sure it's all super tight as well. I mean, it's up to you if you want to look up some torque settings and all that for there, but I've had no trouble in the past, and I've done everything to really snugly and nice and tight, and it's always worked out okay. So yeah, it's all back together. We'll take it for a test drive in a minute, and we should be good to go. So if there's any issues, I'll let you know. I'm just going to, because I've been sort of spraying WD-40 and grease and things like that, I'm just going to give the brake discs and pads a good clean with some brake cleaner, just to make sure there's no grease on them. And while everything's exposed as well, I always take the time just to clean and grease anything up that might need. You know, it just saves a bit of corrosion and wear and things. So it's a good opportunity while everything's apart and you've got access to it as well. So I think we can call that a wrap, and just remember to like and subscribe, and if there's any bits you're not quite sure on here, like I said, look up my other videos on, I think it's a Citroen C3 Picasso top suspension strut or something along those lines, and it shows in more detail things taking them apart and as well. So good luck with that if you ever attempt it, and please feel free to ask any questions and leave any comments, and we'll see you all soon again. Thanks.